that they talk about, the 10 conditions, they tend to co-occur. So if you have one, there's a likelihood you had more than one. If you have 3 or 4 or 5, it's important to know that. It's also important to know what makes you resilient. So when I do these facilitations and I use the ACEs screen and we look at it, it's a personal thing. We also look at a resilience screen. Resilience is strength in the face of adversity, and if you don't do them together, people get hanked out. And it's fair, because their bodies are activated because of what they experience. So that's the first kind of ACEs. Now we're starting to get even smarter now, and there's a second kind of ACEs. It's adverse, you can click now. Adverse community experiences. And this helps us see the connection between the lived experience of some folks, not just in their families or in their history, but in the places and the environments and the neighborhoods and the communities and the schools where they live and grow. These are things that we have talked about. You probably talk about them in Pickens. Will you click again? They take us to these really important issues. If you're in the health field, you're beginning to think about social determinants. What is it in the experience of the environment that causes a person to be very stressed? What about inequity? I don't know your data here, but in the places in Connecticut where I'm working, inequity is a blowaway. We have the largest achievement gaps. In the city I'm working in Bridgeport, where we've been 30 months doing this work, and we are bursting ahead finally, which tells you it takes a while to build trust. 99% of the kids in the school system are on free and reduced price lunch. That tells you something incredibly important. And then, of course, there's a social justice issue. That's also true nationally. I mean, it's very relevant to where we find ourselves now. Yeah?
I work with teens who have experienced a lot of this. Is there any way to reverse ACEs?
So will you give me 5 minutes? I love it when somebody is ahead of me by about 7 steps. So this is good. Don't let me not say something, all right? Okay, so that's that slide. We have 2 kinds of ACEs, and we need to think about both contexts. Yeah.
Will we have access to this?
You can have everything here.
Okay.
And I have piles of other stuff that when we figure out how to make it useful to you, you are welcome to all of it. In Charlotte, where we're just starting this work through a resilience lens, they used a program called Base Camp. So for those of us who are on this working group, we have an online place where we can dump stuff. And it may be that it's Google Docs, or it may be the school has something they could share. So there's a lot of these ways that we could build a place online that is private to you, but as public as you wanted it to be, where materials can be shared. And I have a ton you can have. So it shouldn't be me who does this, right? At some point you should all be deputized and feel comfortable to have some of these conversations, and I want to help you with materials. So that's a great question. Thank you. Could you click? Okay. So this is another one we did last time, but it's important to say again because this is the world you live in. I worked a long time in child welfare. You remember I worked in the prison system and a whole bunch of those back-end services, having been trained as a developmental psychologist. So there's a little discontinuity in there, but I understood how that happened. The Administration for Children, Youth, and Families is where child welfare is managed at the federal level. They look at neglect and abuse, which are not the same, and in fact, of all of the child welfare referrals in the country, 1/3 is abuse. You can see abuse. The rest is neglect. I hate the word neglect, now that I understand the neuroscience. When we look at substantiations, 10 or 15%, maybe 20, is abuse. And the rest is in this bucket they call neglect. Once you know the neuroscience, you realize that neglect is not a good term for the behaviors that families are exhibiting. So they've begun to look at it seriously, and they talk about families that fall into this category, their category, with 3 kinds of buckets. Family basic needs, parental health, and mental health, and then what they see in terms of kids. Could you click? This is for each one of these, the related pieces. I'm not going to read them to you. Just take a look. I'll be quiet for a second. Well, a minute. You see ACEs. You see some of the other health and mental health conditions that are a part of ACEs. You see that stuff that we struggle with. How do we help families meet basic needs, having not given enough credence to the pressure that puts on families? In Bridgeport, we talked to 2,000 moms. Some of them were young and some of them weren't so young, all poor. The biggest stressor in their life was that when they had their babies, they couldn't get through the month with enough diapers. Now that may sound silly to you. On the one hand, it's so hard to imagine. On the other hand, if you're a mom with a baby and you can't even take care of that most basic needs, it speaks to your need level in general, but it also helps you understand how common some of this stuff is for families living in economic challenges. And this is the stuff we see in schools. I don't know, do you expel or suspend kids in preschool? We still do it in Connecticut. It is awful, right? Well, sometimes we're looking at behaviors and zero tolerance, or we tried and we have to send these kids home. Those are sometimes reflective of this development that a child has had. So that's a behavior signal, and we need to be in that space. So that's why they looked at this other bucket. Could you click for me? So we needed, me and the folks that I talk with a lot, we needed a way to talk about what is really going on in the brain science and what's the best current thinking about how to use that in the everyday work that you do and that I used to do when I was in child welfare. So we made this one slide. I joked last time, this is Neuroscience 101 and you should get CEUs or whatever it is that you get for doing this. But it sets the stage and it goes to some of your questionnaire. So I'm gonna take each of these pieces just because it's good to remember. The yellow sunburst, that's good stuff. The blue, which should probably be red but doesn't show up so good, is the not so good stuff. And the arc is the progression for children and families, but it's also the progression of our science, and it should be the progression of our public policy and how we think about our neighborhoods. So let me get in each one just for a minute. We know now that 85% or so of a child's brain, a baby's brain, is really architecturally structured by the time they're 3, 4, and 5. Lots of functions are already beginning to be present. So the first years really matter. When a child has trauma, or there's a break in the parent-child relationships, or there is not one, or you have a depressed mom who can't engage like this, right? Like right up close and personal, then in fact, you will very often find developmental delays. And there's an incredible slide I showed last time, I didn't this time. The more the number of ACEs go up, which is a reflection of that stress, the greater likelihood that by the age of 3 you will have IDA Part C identifiable developmental delay. So there's a very close correlation in this work. That's because the brain is growing so fast. Now the brain is plastic. It doesn't stop growing. There are other critical points in the life of a brain, but damage and delay that's there is harder to correct the further out you go. And the opportunity to grow it right is greatest in the first couple of years, and I would say prenatally through about the 3rd grade. So for me, the 3rd grade reading anchor is a good one, but really it's that whole period where we need to be engaging differently. Cognitive development and social emotional development are absolutely intertwined in the brain because they all depend on the flow of body chemicals that connects part of the brain. You saw that in the slide a little bit. We are now developmental psychologists, like me, looking at a couple key functions that help explain some of those behaviors that we saw. Executive function. Anybody want to tell me what executive function is? Okay. You got here this morning, right? You sent your kids to school. You knew it wasn't Saturday, right? If your car needed gas, you got gas. I mean, I'm being very basic. Executive function are the functions right up here. Plan, study, monitor, do, go back, look again. In your prefrontal cortex, right here. That's what lets us live and control our life. And children and families who are, parents who are vulnerable, that's either delayed or it's impaired in some kind of way. And sometimes in child welfare, we think that that's willful behavior, right? I told them to do this and they didn't even do it. And sometimes it's that the development of the impact of trauma has been so great that executive function is impaired or delayed. Executive function starts little. We can begin to think about self-regulation in preschool, right? I have some of you who work in preschool. I mean, you can begin to learn that behavior. That's because this function is growing. It doesn't, to your question, get fully developed until you're 25 to 30 if you haven't lived in trauma. It starts to grow really fast in the teen years and into young adulthood. The answer to your question is yes. We can be in that space because this part of the brain is growing really fast, and it's possible through trauma-informed environments, through an adult who is a buffer in the life of those children. I'll talk about that in a minute. Through therapy, the movie says it always works. That isn't always the answer, but so we can be with kids in that space, but only if we understand all of this and can help unpack it. These go together. And empathy, somebody, take a guess how soon we find empathy among young children. So I want to know what the devil happened to us as adults. I mean, I'm not completely joking, right? So we're really interested in learning this stuff. The early years really matter, but development continues. The sooner we can get it right, supported to get righter, the easier and more productive that will be for children. What happens when a child is developing, though, is sometimes families live in that stuff. I told you my story, my trauma story of being widowed as overseas, being widowed as a military wife with a baby that was in the 9th month of pregnancy, and what the impact was on that baby's life. It was huge, and it went on, and he's now 49. So, I mean, it's been a life for this young man. We didn't understand it. The docs didn't understand it. Now we know. We know that my body changed because of what happened to the cortisol in my body when I was pregnant. That's this stuff. That's what happens in pregnancy, but it also happens in the lives of adults. So when trauma and toxic stress and adversity piles on top of this, it delays development. So if you have kids who are feeling delayed, you can't just look at the kid, right? And you don't anyway, but you have to go back and look at the circumstances. When children, this is like hard stuff, but you know, what the heck, we're brave, right? When children live in poverty, when there is demonstrable racism, when there is implicit bias, which is of course everywhere, when there's big inequity, and I would say even now politics, egotripism, this is a pile-on for children who've already experienced trauma or toxic stress, who don't have a positive adult as a buffer, and development is delayed again, and the body is in control, and cortisol takes over, and it's fight, flight, or freeze, and that's what we see. So these two things, one on top of the other, on top of development, is how we need to understand vulnerable children. That's what the ACEs study is all about. It's not willful. It is that the biology of your body has changed. It can pass from generation to generation. That's why they say this is intergenerational. And we can deal with it once we know what we've got. This is where we're going as a field, helping children to center, focus, be mindful in their own bodies. Schools are actually doing this with incredible success with little children now, as well as, well, I think I gave the example of a middle school in one of our urban cities, in one of our urban communities where it was an automatic zero tolerance policy for 8th graders if you did something bad. And they realized they didn't have enough kids in school after a while. So they did mandatory yoga, which for the first couple of weeks, kids hated. Oh my, well you can imagine, right? You live with kids. By the end of a month, and by the end of the semester, chronic absences were down, behavior was under control, kids were not punching, fighting, because they had learned to center. And there were enough of them that began to change the culture of the school. We are also moving to understand resilience. This is my last little bit in the slide, and I'm taking the liberty because it's 101 neuroscience, right? So I get to give you a course here. Mindfulness is inside, self-control is inside, kindness is inside and outside, health is inside and outside. So we move from our insideness, the biology of our bodies, to our outsideness, was our relationship with people in a touch way, in a real way, in a social and positive way. And it's not rocket science But resilience is not grit, it's not perseverance, you need that stuff. It is having a positive network of people, or if you're a kid, at least one person, a coach, lots of times for older children, who is that countable on. You are it for these foster children. You are it. The positive adult that buffers the trauma and allows children to exist in their space and move forward with their growth. It's not something they didn't teach us little bits about, but we did not understand how deeply it's embedded in the biology of our bodies. And that gives us room to look at these behaviors when they occur in a wholly different way. Can I go forward?
I have something on my heart. As I listen to all this, I'm thinking the value of play. You could talk about the value
Absolutely.
of play. You know, because that's their escape, that's their give it back to the moment.
Yes. And in
And we take it away.
We do. We're doing a lot of things a little bit on the dumb side now in terms of the environments that we're creating for children. And we're putting pressures down all over that remove the opportunity for that lived experience to be a different one. We really should be pushing that stuff up, honestly, than putting it down. But those are changes we can make, right? There's a great, when you get the extra videos, there's a great clip from a preschool that serves 2 to 5 year olds. It's all about mindfulness through play. It's just stunning. You watch it and you just, you're in that space. The Pope has taken to talking about tenderness. About 1.5 years ago, he said, we need a culture of tenderness, and everybody laughed. No, what he was saying is, we need to be in this space here, the positive brain chemical space, and we know how to build them. Next time I come, I'll talk to you about that clump of positive body chemicals versus this clump of not positive body chemicals. It's a pretty funny story. I've got a great slide, so we'll go a little bit deeper into the biology next time. Would you click for me, real quick? Oh, yeah, we should have been clicking all along, shouldn't we?
Sorry.
You're fired. Okay, no. Okay, so one more click. So the neuroscience says start early. As early as we can do early. It isn't just birth now, we know. You gotta scooch back. And people have argued, and they're right, we need to be back into preconceptual care because this stuff is intergenerational. So it matters where you are in high school. It matters where your development is. It matters what you do as a youth leader. That stuff really matters. Click. This is how in a lot of places we're starting to think about early childhood. We say it goes from the prenatal period through the 3rd grade. The 3rd grade, because it's reading at 3rd grade, is the national marker now, and it needs to be. It is not the only predictor of children's success. And in fact, I will argue that social emotional learning should be right up there with that. So if that's not progressing in the same way reading is, and in fact you need them both together, where the reading piece is going to be not what it could be. In the places that I've been privileged to be, we take those years and we break them into 3 bunches of 3. First of all, it's scientifically right and it makes good sense and it's easy to talk about. Secondly, because it lets us pick a smaller clump to start with. I think you're probably going to end up in one of these bottom 2 groups of 3, and we talked last time about the babies. That's my pitch. What about the babies? I just think that's where we have to go. But that's what they look like. In Bridgeport, we call the prenatal to the age of 3, born healthy and ready at 3. We're going to ask you today to think about what that would mean here. What would it mean if children were ready at 3? What are the behaviors? How do we measure that? How do we know, right? The second one is 3s, 4s, so preschool, and 5s. You might ask why we do 5s. In the places where I have worked, sometimes the school system sits over here, and the preschool system sits over here, and we don't have a good stitching between them. So issues of transition and curriculum alignment and other pieces of focus on development don't get made very well. You have a great program here in South Carolina called Countdown to Kindergarten, which begins to reach that space. But we do that because at our table, then we can get kindergarten teachers as well as preschool teachers, and boy, does that make a difference. It also buys the schools, and then the last is what happens when the whole environment changes and kids go to school. So click for me, please. So a decision for you as you go forward is where you want to focus. You can do it all. That's a little daunting to start with, and stakeholders are very different, and it's a lot of work. So we have focused, Emily and I have focused in these first 3 years because the science is just so strong, and resilience pushes us there. Would you click, please? Okay. Now you have started to do amazing stuff, and I told people, I'm bragging on you all over I go. You have taken the Palmetto basics. You were very early in the world in partnering on to that process of enabling parents and other caregivers to see visually 5 principles about early development. And I'm gonna let you stand up here just for a second to make sure everybody knows what they are. What you have begun to do is to think about how all the programs you have match up to that. If you go in the library, you're gonna see the coolest thing about the Palmetto basics. And if you're not using them, you need to begin to embed them. But kudos to you. Could you click one more time? Yeah. So this business of being in that born healthy and ready at 3 space, you've already started, and you've used what you adopted early on in this process. You're kind of famous. I mean, we're trailing behind you, but we're gonna get there. To look at what programs you already have in that space, and to organize them by whether they promote the reduction of stress, right? Or whether they're really focused on early literacy or early math skills or movement, right? Or conversation. That's how the basics works. Do you want to does everybody here know what the Palmetto basics are? Everybody? Okay, then you can sit down. So kudos to you. You've already started work in this space. And the last time, Emily had taken the basics framework and begun to lay out what programs you already have, so we can see where the needs are. If you decide to stay in the 0 to 3 space, prenatal to 3, that's a really good start, and she might ask you to do some more of it today. Could you click for me? When I came last time, I said to you another place took a little different approach, although the basics in that place are embedded in a bigger framework. We said, what would it take to reverse a data point? Does anybody remember what that data point was that I told you it was so hard? I'll remind you. It's really hard enough to remember, so you can use this as an example. We were trying to answer the question, how would we know if kids were ready for preschool or ready for Head Start? How ready were they at 3? Because we knew they weren't ready at 5, right? And we knew good stuff was happening in those 2 years. So the only data point we could find was the initial entry assessment into Head Start using Teaching Strategies Gold. That is a curriculum normed assessment. So we took the first measure when kids came into the school at 3 in this very poor city. 3/4 of the children who entered Head Start, this may be true for you too, I don't think it's limited to urban environments, were behind, where they would have been expected to be in a normal context, right? So that's bad. I mean, that's really bad. And so it said to us, move earlier and earlier. So our question was, how do we do that? We did not believe that we could pick one single program and change the life of these families. Although any one program would have been a little more than we had to start with. So we built a framework. We call it the baby bundle. I'm gonna push that a little bit so we think about it a little bigger. We focused on supporting parents and other primary caregivers. We talked a little bit last time about who takes care of babies when they're not in your infant and toddler centers and their parents are working. Informal care, which is the bugaboo of a lot of our work. And we looked at what evidence-based programs work, and you do that already. So this is a pretty standard one. Then we knew that we couldn't move this forward unless there was a whole bajillion of us pushing. Civic engagement. We can't do this just ourselves. And we looked at some strategies for building that. We knew we had to pay for this. This may be something we want to talk about some more as you go forward. So we engaged with ICS. They have some amazing people looking at pay for success and other children's financing strategies, and we did a business plan for each of those things we wanted to expand. I mean, we just forced ourselves to figure out what it would cost and how we might think about paying for it. Medicaid was a big piece of our operation because 7 out of 10 babies in Bridgeport are Medicaid. 1 out of 2, I think, in Pickens, right? 49% if I saw the data right. So your Medicaid systems should be a piece at some point of your process, as well as IDA Part C and other things. We knew, however, that we couldn't find all of the best stuff in any of these buckets unless we actually were in communities, because communities invent stuff that's pretty cool, and because you can engage the faith sector and the libraries and other natural supports. So we knew we had to do that. And we knew if we only did evidence-based, that's random control trial, right, which limits the pool of programs, that we would never find the new stuff, because random control trial programs started with somebody's innovation, right? So if there's not room in this for us to be trying and learning, we'll never get to the next bunch of programs that work. And then lastly, data, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So that was our bundle. Here's where we have gone, and I'm about done, so I'm gonna hand this back, and I'll help facilitate, but we have some work to do. This is where I started, right here. Could you click? Okay, so yes, you have to start with the brain stuff. You just got to. 2, we thought about those cohorts and decided where to focus. We couldn't do them all. We tried, didn't work. And then we didn't succeed at all. So we had no even early successes to show people. It was very frustrating. So we were right here. This is where we started. These are the 2 pieces we have learned in the last 7 or 8 months, and they're as relevant to you now, early on. So I'm gonna save you 6 or 8 months of agony that we went through to try and figure out how to move this forward. I'm just gonna unpack these 2 really quick. So we argued, you can click on this one, that nothing we would seek to expand or to implement will be successful unless there is a 21st century system for managing programs and agencies there. And I'll tell you what I mean. Right? In some of the places that I'm working in North Carolina, which are counties and don't have a lot of resources, their non-for-profit sector and even their schools and their libraries are very fragile in terms of what keeps them running successfully. And so for us to come in and lay on 15 new programs, and we should do this, on a system that was under stress, was gonna reduce the likelihood that we would be successful. Could you click? This one has a couple of clicks. So this is what we think are the stuff that needs to be in our minds as we move forward. It's another bunch of stuff, but it's all logical. And if you're running an agency, or you're running a library, or you're running a school system, you do this stuff all the time. So first of all, real-time data, you have to know, right? Not data from 20 years ago. It doesn't work anymore. And because babies only have 3 years from when they're born to 3, right? We can't wait for 10 years to get 3-year-old data. Makes sense, right? Doesn't work very well in a lot of places. So this is a biggie. We could share data better, and I think you'll be able to find data together that may not have been shared, where big states and systems have trouble. They fight that one through. We need to do strategic communications. Who's the communication person who raised their head and said? Right. The lady
I think
with
that's
the camera,
me.
right?
I think that's me.
We need to figure out a way to talk about this that we can sell it. We talk about what about the babies? 4 words. And we can have those 4 words with anybody really fast, and that's the way we open the conversation. You have to think about strategic communications from the beginning, because we're about persuading, right? Civic engagement. We have to bring in university relationships because they know ahead of us on some of this stuff, although often it isn't developed in context. So we're trying to figure out how to build university relationships. You have Clemson down the street. You probably all have relationships. You have USC, very strong partnerships. They need to be formalized as part of this work. We need to look at our policies. We make policy that turns out to be kind of dumb when you actually look at the brain science. You probably have your favorite set of policies you would change if you had the chance. Your resources need to be a little flexible. Otherwise, you're stuck in the buckets that you're funding. That will be especially true in the school. You will have lots of pots of money in the school, but maybe not flexible enough. The ESSA is a good one, which pushes us into family engagement. Title I is a good one, which lets us do things. But sometimes they're not so flexible and we can't marry them up. But there's money there, and we need to figure that out. We need to be in your agencies